Well, welcome everybody. This is our analysis of India Stack. Let me just briefly introduce the Internet Governance Project. We are a university-based research, policy analysis, and sometimes advocacy center here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the USA. We've been around for a long time, and we have, in fact, noticed a shift in the nature of what we might want to call internet governance. We are now seeing more and more that we're talking about a digital ecosystem that includes the internet, but also includes data resources, software production, and and computing devices. And as you all know, all of those have been embroiled in various kinds of international political economy issues. And we're very interested in the way digitization is contributing to economic development and the development of governance. And so about a year ago, Jyoti Panday, one of our staff members, brought to our attention this notion of India Stack, which was developing in India and was synthesizing identity, payment systems, and data governance. So I'm going to turn it over to Jyoti. We released a very long research paper that she did about India Stack, and we have assembled here three distinguished panelists to discuss the paper. So we'll give Jyoti about 15 to 20 minutes to present an overview of her paper, and then we'll have discussions from the rest of the panelists who I'll introduce when she's finished. So Jyoti, go ahead.
Thank you, Milton. Welcome everyone, and thank you for the panelists who are here and who will join us later. My name is Jyoti Panday. I work with Professor Mueller at IGP. Like Professor Mueller mentioned, the work on India Stack has been going on at IGP for at least 2 years, but I have been following the developments around India Stack as long as my career in tech policy has lasted, and I hope to continue following these developments. It's relatively new, and not very many people are familiar with the label India Stack, but given the push for digital public infrastructure later and how India Stack is being integrated with the DPI developments in developing digital public infrastructure, we are hoping that India Stack is going to become a fairly well-known label. Let me just share the presentation. Is it visible? So, like I mentioned, so data, software, networks, and digital devices are core components of the political economy of the 21st century. Their governance is being shaped in disparate international and domestic forums and through laws and bilateral agreements. Various stakeholders, including states with contending visions of who should have control and rights in the digital economy, and how this control and rights should be exercised, are shaping these rules of governance. And they're coming together to set norms, rules, agreements, or governing digital ecosystem and cross-border services. Moving beyond the framing of all markets want to get rid of the government and all governments want to get rid of markets, IGP has been calling for the need to revive political economy as the underlying discipline, supporting the theory and practice of public policy in the digital world. In this research, we set out to understand how political and market institutions coexist and come together to shape digital policy making in India. In particular, we were interested in unpacking India's turn to digital nationalism. Towards that end, we reviewed and synthesized historical and current academic and policy literature with the goal of identifying shared elements and trends across political regimes and various domains. Our research throws up that India has three basic priorities: addressing poverty, strengthening the economy, and protection from both internal and external threats. Given these three priorities, we are seeing a mixture of state and market-based strategies which are leading towards India's pursuit of data sovereignty. So we've seen over the last few, in the paper, we trace back the turn towards sovereignty from post-independence India in 1950s until the present regime, which is the BJP-led NDA alliance. But we wanted to kind of also develop a conceptual framework to understand what exactly is meant by the term data sovereignty, and to see if we could identify certain elements or prongs or strategies that were common across the pursuit of data sovereignty. We realized that the Indian government is using, not just the government, a lot of corporations, digital companies, stakeholders, whether they are think tanks, aligned with the government's vision of tech policy governance, or those that are critical of the government's policy. The term data sovereignty or digital sovereignty is prevalent across all quarters, though there are varying interpretations and meanings of it. However, the core idea is that data generated by Indians belongs to or is most secure and best taken care of by the Indian government, or some form of this framing. There are various justifications that various stakeholders use to kind of push this idea forward. So there is a framing of data colonialism, where the economic practices of big tech companies are framed as being extracted and framed as a colonial mentality of trying to take resources where the Indians do not gain the benefit that they should be deriving from resources which belongs to them. The colonialism framing has a lot of impact and resonates in India because of our history, being under the colonial rule. There's another framing which is being relied upon increasingly, which is that of data empowerment. Under the data empowerment framing, citizens are deemed to be given a right over their data, and data sovereignty practices are framed as interventions by the state on behalf of the citizens to secure the rights over their data. And therefore, the state is a custodian of the citizens' data, and therefore pursuing data sovereignty to empower them to derive the benefits from their data. Given these two justifications, and with a broader understanding of how various stakeholders are approaching data sovereignty, we went about creating a conceptual framework and identified two strategic prongs. The first is focused on restriction of data, whereas the second is more focused on accumulation of data. Under restriction of data, data is linked to national security is emphasized, and controls for data around controls over data are justified as security measures. So data localization, where data is restricted within a particular border or territory, restricting certain services, as we saw with Chinese apps, regulation of crypto, and the recent regulations which led to VPN providers moving their servers out of India. Another particular aspect of this strategy of restricting data is establishing new categories of data which are not very well defined or are quite broad in what kinds of data they would cover. So, for example, categories like critical and sensitive data. Under accumulation of data, it's the opposite spectrum, where data's economic value is emphasized, and controls to create and share data, including creating high-value data sets, enabling sharing of data, as we saw with the non-personal data bill, and the non-personal data committee, its recommendations, and the new category of data that it introduced, which was community data. Here, instead of restricting access to data, the focus of policy interventions are to get companies to share the data that they have collected through their services. So coming on to, if we understand data sovereignty to be informing the Indian government's position on data and technology governance in India, then we decided to focus on one of these interventions, which is emerging under the label of India Stack. India Stack is an amalgamation of industry initiatives. It's pursued by both of India's major political parties. Most of these India Stack services or solutions emerged in the context of welfare and government services and are being expanded through financial inclusion. In our opinion, though, India Stack is a great example of how the government is putting in play its accumulation and restriction strategies. To note, however, India Stack does not cover every aspect of India's data sovereignty-based approach to governance of data, but it is where the government's efforts are most visible and where the impact is, quite widespread, given the design and structure of India Stack. So again, I'm not going to get into too much details here, but just to let our audience know who haven't gone through the paper yet, we don't just introduce India Stack, we kind of go a little bit back into the history, trying to situate what kind of political factors and economic factors came together and brought together various stakeholders. And our understanding of the entire ecosystem is that both in digital identity and digital payments, various stakeholders were coming together due to different economic and political reasons. And the impetus was given through the digitization push by the current regime. And all of these various initiatives and efforts across domains were neatly brought together under the label of India Stack. But the evolution of India Stack has not been linear. And it has been far more, therefore we can see why it is so widespread and why it cuts across so many different domains. So coming to, and just to introduce the 4 layers, digital identity is the presence-less layer. That's a foundational layer of India Stack. On top of the digital identity layer, we have the paperless layer, which is about proving your identity and kind of authenticating documents and then storing those documents in a government-provided cloud-based service. The cashless layer enables digital payments, and consent layer is about data sharing. The consent layer is the latest version or the latest introduction, and therefore is the least evolved, whereas Aadhaar was introduced first, and in terms of its intervention has been the longest lasting. So Aadhaar, how does it take forward the data sovereignty-based strategies of India, of the Indian government and the Indian market institutions? What we saw with digital identity, the government decided to get into provisioning ID for the entire Indian population because it lacked the technical capacity to do so. It created an entity called UIDI, but to help it to kind of take this technological project forward. But in doing so, it also managed to kind of outsource its governance aspects of management and providing digital identity to UIDI. So for example, it was UIDI that decided on biometrics. It was UIDI that kind of got into RFPs with various vendors, chose various foreign biometric technology providers. So between UIDI managing the project and the state providing legitimacy for Aadhaar and the digital identity project in India, we see market and state collaboration. Similarly, for restricting access to digital identity, the CIDR, the centralized database where all Aadhaar numbers are stored, was created. And again, we see the kind of national security-based arguments to push forward data localization mandates. Even though national security is used as a rationale, we do see that the Aadhaar ecosystem is plagued by a lot of frauds, plagued by data leakages, it's plagued by grievance redressal mechanisms which are not catching up with the state of play, and which, there are various problems from unavailability of telecom and internet services to, readers failing, to biometrics not working. And the system is not keeping pace with the demand. So again, in terms of digital, securing the digital public infrastructure of Aadhaar, lots needs to be done still. Aadhaar also enabled new concentration of power. For example, the foreign biometric providers that were brought into the project, they had access to the entire data for up to 3 years under contract with the UIDI. And therefore, we also saw that with the AUAs, the authenticating user agencies and the KYC user agencies, UIDA mandated what kind of data storage and access rights they would have. However, it did not provide encryption or storage standards for them. Enabling accumulation and use of identity data, we've seen the government, so Aadhaar was legislated for a really long time in the courts, and despite the ongoing case, its use to digital identity has become pretty essential for operating in the digital economy today. Can you hear me? Okay. So similarly with, now we move to the cashless digital payments. Just like UIDI, created, allowed the state to kind of create control over the digital identity market. The RBI authorized NPCI to create, mechanisms for digital payments, namely RUPay and the Unified Payments Interface, UPI, both of which have been quite successful. Again, the success of these two platforms or services have been enabled by the state, giving it legitimacy due to certain policy interventions which scaled up demand. And NPCI, by virtue of controlling these platforms and services, has managed to gain control and gain access or restrict access to a large part of the digital payments market in India. With restricting data, we saw that the RBI put in data localization mandate and went ahead and asked payment providers to kind of maintain copies of all payments data in India. This was in fact one of the most controversial data localization mandates coming anywhere in the past few years, anywhere in the world, and was quite contested by various US companies, namely MasterCard and Visa, as well as the US India Business Council. We saw, apart from putting in a localization mandate, we are also seeing the government move towards enforcement of the mandate, where it is considering penalties for providers that are not complying. In terms of enabling concentration of power, we've seen the government and NPCI and RBI come together. So NPCI is it started out with 10 promoter banks, and today the membership has been expanded to 66 banks. And there is talk of diversifying it to bring in wallets and other payment providers. But a bunch of banks basically run NPCI. This is not a government mandated institution or entity. So therefore, they would be key industry players that are kind of responsible for regulating the digital payments market. Within NPCI leading the charge for developing the digital payments market, it has led to a new concentration of power. The government has been enabling subsidies, the zero MDR fees have been put in place, which have allowed both RUPay and UPI to kind of gain an advantage over other competing systems. Again, it's state and market collaborating to kind of create this new concentration of power. And this is situated in the economic competition that led, with Indian banks and foreign technology providers, which were largely these credit card companies in the 90s. Accumulation and use of data, we see UPI expanding into credit. We hear talk about UPI being exported to other countries. We don't know what exporting UPI to other countries translates in terms of economic advantage for India. But we do realize that UPI expanding into credit, etc., makes it a very powerful entity in the larger financial ecosystem, because it has such granular data on transactions and such detailed data trails that for it to get into credit, it is already walking in as a big player to contend with. Securing digital public infrastructure in the payments landscape has been difficult. As UPI has grown, so have frauds using UPI, so have scamsters using these digital payment methods and exploiting the lack of digital literacy to kind of game the system. And once again, the laws and our security infrastructure has not been able to catch up. A lot of the designation of these critical payment systems. So, for example, UPI is labeled and claimed to be a digital public infrastructure. However, one of the critical labelings which ensure that it meets the security parameters that apply to other highly critical payments infrastructure does not apply to UPI. So there's need for the government to kind of drill down and work on the laws and governance of these critical infrastructure. The consent layer or data sharing layer is fairly new. As I mentioned, it's not mandatory yet. The consent layer is being rolled out in the financial system through the account aggregator model. And there are various aspects that are being developed, even as the ecosystem for account aggregators is being explored. There is talk of expanding its scope to other sectors, for example, to bring in telecom service providers and kind of qualify them as account aggregators, because telecom data is one of the most initial digital data trails. DEPA is another model that has been introduced. It's again fairly new. It kind of situates and talks about personal data and frames it as a tradable asset. So again, coming from the data empowerment kind of perspective, where citizens have rights over the data and they have the rights to kind of trade that data in exchange for either services or other benefits. It encourages users to disclose data about themselves for economic gains. However, it largely relies on the idea of consent, which is limited and needs to be evolving to kind of contextualize the use of the data. And these factors still are work in progress and need to be thought through way more. So overall, what are the key takeaways in this paper? Our perspective is, IGP's perspective is that India Stack enables and takes forward India's data sovereignty-based approach to governance of data. The state support stems from the efforts to extend sovereignty over data precisely. It is a result of state market collaboration, where initially certain government projects, because the government lacked technical capability, it brought in software developers, and now these software developers are developing services at scale for the entire population, much of which are not public and could qualify as private services as well. And the scale of these services allows these architects of these projects to claim labels like digital public infrastructure and digital public goods. However, there is nuance and a lot of literature behind these, what is infrastructure, what is public, and what is public goods. And therefore, a lot more work needs to be done on unpacking and applying these labels to India Stack. Thank you. It's a long paper, and for everyone who's read that and made it, and everyone who's going to go away from here and read it, thank you for your patience. And yes, that's it. Look forward to questions.
Thanks very much, Jyoti. That I would, in fact, encourage you to read the full paper. I found it fascinating, particularly the way it goes through the very long historical development and all of the political clashes over Aadhaar in particular, and then how Aadhaar was integrated into the payment systems. And it's very important to pay attention to the interest groups and the motivations of the people as they're constructing this digital infrastructure. So now we have some extremely good panelists to discuss the paper. And we're going to begin with Anupam Chander, who I've known for some time, or at least I've read his law review articles. He's done amazing work about data nationalism, for example, and some of the digital trade issues that I found to be extremely illuminating. So Anupam, got 10 minutes to have a discussion, and then we'll go to Smriti.
Great. So first of all, I want to encourage everyone to read this paper. I found it incredibly illuminating. It's really a masterpiece. It's so comprehensive. As Milton says, it describes the history and the politics, which I think also is really important, because politics is essential to understand. I hadn't, for example, recognized that both parties were so protectionist in their fundamental, in their kind of approach to things. So I had assumed kind of more liberal inclination, economic inclination, at least in one of the parties. But I was struck by the history of protectionism that suffuses politics. And of course, that means, and there's obviously in India a special understanding of the need to avoid foreign actors. That history is, if we often understand Europe's approach to data privacy as based on its history. And in that sense, we could understand India's approach to data sovereignty or digital sovereignty as emanating from its history. So its history being just exactly as recent as the Europeans' history. India sloughed off colonialism in 1947, actually shortly after Europe finished the horrors of the Second World War. And so I can understand that kind of historic concern. It's interesting to note that sometimes that concern is now not really targeted necessarily at American or Western enterprises. It's really targeted at Chinese or possibly Pakistani influences. The end-to-end encryption material is very much targeted at Pakistan, I gather, from the paper. And so fascinating to see that kind of history being reshaped in the context of current conflicts, which are really South-South conflicts, though the last couple of days have reopened the wounds between North and South as well, because now we're seeing Canada point fingers at India in a particular way. I found I have to comment on the Canadian-Indian fracas because it's really going to shape Indian politics and data sovereignty questions in its own way. The West seems to have forgotten that Americans sent military forces into Pakistan without the invitation of the Pakistanis to kill a person in Pakistan, not a Pakistani citizen, but Pakistani citizens likely killed during that process. This targeted assassination look, for Osama bin Laden, I cheered that event. So let me just but the incursions upon sovereignty seem to be occurring in a variety of contexts, and we should recognize that if this occurred in Canada, there's been a long history of this emanating from the West. I don't know if the Canadians criticized the incursion onto Pakistani territorial sovereignty. So issues of sovereignty, I'm going to pause here. I've been just struck by the way the data protection law, as it's finally been adopted, did not adopt the strongest version of data localization, instead giving a kind of right to insist upon data localization in certain contexts, but not kind of reflexively or by default building in data localization, which was the earlier versions of the statute that were mooted in the last couple of years. So kind of a retreat from data localization as I see it in the latest version. So in any case, congratulations to Jyoti and the team. Terrific paper. The one small request as an American would be the word crore is very hard for Americans to understand. So if you could, in every moment, put in the dollar equivalent in millions or billions, that would be much appreciated. All right, I will pass the microphone on. Thank you very much, Jyoti. Congratulations.
Thank you, Anupam, and we will continue to benefit from your discussion, I think, as we go on, but we're allowing each panelist to make individual comments. So now we are going to turn to Smriti, and she is a fellow at the Cyber Bricks Project, which is a very interesting project run out of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School in Brazil. And this is a collaborative research project which studies digital governance and transformation strategies in the BRICS. So I think this will be a very interesting perspective to have on the paper. And one of the things I did want to emphasize is that we do need, as Americans and Europeans, need to pay more attention to what's happening in the BRICS around digital public infrastructure, digital sovereignty, and so on. So looking forward to Smriti Parshira's perspectives on the paper. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Milton. Firstly, let me echo what both you and Anupam have said on how the paper is so excellent and comprehensive, and the ability, Jyoti, to really condense all that in these 20 minutes, because, you know, that's really 100 pages of a lot of wealth of information, and you did such a great job of presenting the key points out of that. So congratulations on that. So I'll make two sets of comments, you know, a few talking about my context as a researcher with the Cyber Bricks project, and then going into a research paper that I put out last year, which looks at, you know, some of the constituents of India stack and puts it in the lens of a competition law analysis to look at, and I'll explain, but I basically reason that, you know, just as we have concerns with big tech, creation of these digital infrastructures is taking us into the domain of what I provocatively call alt big tech. And I'm going to explain why I use that labeling, and, you know, what are the characteristics. And I think many of those characteristics have already been explained in Jyoti's presentations, but I'll just give some structure to it to, you know, justify that all big tech framing. So firstly, on the the BRICS part of it, of course, what we've been studying in the project is, you know, trying to understand what are the kind of initiatives that are happening in these 5 countries, both in terms of adoption of digital infrastructures, but also what we are seeing, you know, culminating in India's case with the G20 in the outward perception. And that's a suggestion on the paper, you know, where you identified the priorities, Jyoti. I think even this kind of, you know, this export of tech now is becoming a big priority for India, which we are seeing in the, you know, the India Stack global website that has been created, the whole DPI initiative as it came through in the G20 summit. This really pitch, which was the highlight really from India's perspective of trying to get, you know, some kind of consensus in terms of adoption of a definition of what DPIs are. And also along with that saying that, you know, we already have this suite of products, so, you know, the world can look at these and develop these. I think that's also emerging as a big policy priority for India. And of course, you know, in addition to this outward looking policy, there is the inward looking developments, which you've explained in the Indian context, but similarly in the Brazil context, there is this, payments infrastructure called PIX, which is owned by their central banks, which is a similar instant interbank payment system, which has been created and doing similarly, as phenomenally well as the UPI. And that's something which colleagues have been studying. But with that, I'm going to jump a little bit into, you know, the all big tech framing that I was talking about. And as we see this, I mean, I would divide what the DPI ecosystem in India into 2 heads. One is the kind of ecosystem constituents like Aadhaar, or the, you know, the health stack, which we are seeing, which are basically initiatives within the government, which are owned and run fully by the government, of course, with private participation, but these are really government run projects, versus, things like the NPCI, the data empowerment architecture, the new open digital commerce architecture, which are really state endorsed initiatives, but are run in the private sector, are owned by a private sector non-profit entity, and which really plays a lot of role in the standard setting as well as in the operationalizing of these architectures. And my comments are really on this second set of entities, which I say have the potential of becoming all big tech. So when we think of big tech, we think of certain characteristics like their economic power. We talk about the size and the user base of these entities. We talk about the data intelligence that they have. We have the infrastructure capabilities. We have their societal impacts. And really, if you try to break this down in the context of what you describe in these entities, take the NPCI as an example, which is the most advanced of the DPIs, in this private group, we see a lot of the similar characters. Of course, there is no economic power, but there is state endorsement as a replacement for that economic power, which gives them this quasi-regulatory kind of power and the ability to decide that, we will let a WhatsApp into the market or not let it, or when we let a WhatsApp in, we will set limits on how many users they can have, or we will say that there should be 30% market cap on the number of users that a payment entity should have. So these are all kind of exertion of state blessed powers which a private entity is exercising, effectively acting as a regulator. Scale and data effects, that the basic idea behind all these entities is that they are supposed to be delivering population scale transformation. So there is a lot of government backing in terms of policies being tweaked, in terms of zero fees on some accounts, in terms of direct indirect coercion on other accounts, in order to promote these products. Infrastructure lock-in is a big part of the design of the product. So something like the NPCI, we know that there was some talk about, trying to bring in a competitor, a new umbrella entity, which will similarly develop products which might compete with the NPCI, but that was quelled and that died down. So effectively, we've reached a scale where there is a lock-in, there is a lot of, money, time, energy, which has gone into building scale in these products. And the innovation that is now happening is expected to happen within these products. So, whether it's recurring payments or with its linking of UPI to, credit cards, all of that will happen within UPI. You don't see a competitor to UPI coming and doing all of this. And of course, there is this question of limited accountability in all of this, right? Who are these entities accountable to? As private, not-for-profit entities, they are not accountable to the public in the sense of listed companies. They're also not accountable to the public in the sense of being covered under Right to Information Act. So that seems to be a deliberate design choice to prevent them from being, burdened by maybe procurement procedures, etc., which government entities are. But similarly, they, as a part of that process, they get excluded from core accountability concerns, which are missing. So for all of these reasons, I say there is a lot of development happening as a result of DPI. There's interesting, scaling happening, but there is this, potentially dark side of it, which we need to think about, which will have an impact on innovation and competition in the long run. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. We'll want to follow up on some of those observations, but we're also fortunate to have with us today Dr. Pramod Varma, and he was actually involved in the creation of India Stack. He's the former chief architect of Aadhaar, India's digital identity program, which currently covers 1.3 billion people. And he was also the architect for certain India Stack layers, such as e-sign, digital locker, and unified payment interface. So he's currently the CTO of XStep Foundation, which is a not-for-profit creating learner-centric digital public goods under Project Sunbird. And these projects are supposed to power India's largest digital learning infrastructure, providing opportunities to 200 million children and 10 million plus teachers in India. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Varma now, and thank you again for coming here today.
Thank you for having me. Oh, well, okay. Sorry, I came in late today. So, what is there a question or how? Sorry, I joined halfway through. So, set me up here so it's easier for me.
We can hear you, and yeah, you're sounding fine. Did you have slides? Is that what you're talking about?
No. So I'm okay. I wasn't sure what is the initial question, because I came in halfway through the panel. Sorry about that.
Oh, well, we're just interested in your observations about the paper that Jyoti wrote, and what is there anything you wish to correct, or do you think it was accurate, or do you think there are additional observations that could be made? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, when I looked at that paper, Jyoti, congratulations again. It was tremendously in depth. I don't think we have seen any paper that is gone into the history of many of these layers and unearthed a lot of nuances from behind the scene. So I was quite surprised because these are the points many people tend to miss and tend to just write very superficial, top level observations. But Jyoti has done a phenomenal job actually writing a lot of details. I have been part of 13 years in this journey, building pretty much everything she has written there. So, as a creator and builder of many of this, uh, I was very happy to see the kind of depth that she went into to bring us the historical connections and the institutional connections behind the scene, uh, which is a lot of times missed out. And I wear many hats, and part of one of my hats is Center for Digital Public Infrastructure. It's an academic center, and that center currently we are speaking to at least 24 to 30 countries. And G20 has elevated the conversation about digital public infrastructure. And few days back, I was in Washington talking to 30 countries. Uh, I think that there is tremendous interest in around the world, especially post-COVID, to apply, uh, take digital as a means to reach the vulnerable section, bring equity, inclusion, and but while still creating some sort of innovation market layer, because just government trying to do everything is unsustainable, and it's sort of promotes very one-sided government digitization efforts. So DPI, digital public infrastructure way of thinking, has shown that you can actually bring the best of government and best of society, in the civil society, and best of market. And that was very surprising to many countries when they looked at India, that we activated a ton of market innovation on top of the digital public infrastructure. So I think that combination plays out really well because it addresses diversity, it addresses inclusion issues, because if society is included, if market is included, everybody's cares are being taken care in one sense. If only you architect it well. That was the idea of digital public infrastructure. And India has shown not only that if you bring these three actors together to bring their own best of their side, we also showed in one sense that you can create non-linear or exponential change. And that's why we went from no one having identity to 1 billion people having identity in 7 years, and no one having bank account. It was less than 20% in 2008, 2009, even 2010. We were less than 20% banking. By 2020, we were 90% banking penetration. So we compressed, according to the Bureau of International Studies, I think, Jyoti, as you covered that, we have compressed 5 decades of potential development cycle into 1 decade. And that's tremendous. And it's only possible if you bring the government, civil society, and market to work together on top of a shared infrastructure, public infrastructure, like the way internet is built, or like the way telephony networks are built, population scale networks are built. So I think the timing of this report uh, is perfectly aligned. So that's also, sometimes you don't get the timing right. And Jyoti, it's very nice that you got the timing really right as India ready to transition our G20 presidency to Brazil, and who has again committed, and Brazil has publicly made the statements about financial inclusion and financial well-being being one of their biggest agenda that they'll be taking, in addition to climate and other compelling elements. But they have said DPI is a way of thinking, and they said I can apply DPI to unbundle my climate resilience story and so on, right? So we will see this going into Brazil and subsequently South Africa, and then eventually goes back to US, the G20. So I think your timing on that is also very well timed. So I think at this time, the necessity, and we see this repeating in every country, the necessity of applying digital as a means to bring equity inclusion is unquestioned. The question was, is this the same old digitization story? Should government keep building more and more? Or should just leave everything to private industry and let them solve it? Or should we leave everything to civil society and say, let the you solve it? And what India, as we have seen, is that none of them can actually solve it. These are complex, multidimensional societal challenges, such as education, healthcare, climate resilience, or anything that we are tackling. It's a one department problem. It's never one company problem. It's never one NGO problem. It has to be tackled collectively. And what a DPI as a means to achieve that means to bring the right building blocks to be able to solution towards more inclusive and equitable digital economy was very key. And that's exactly what India has shown repeatedly. And Jyoti has captured that history and success factors beautifully. So thank you for doing it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Verma. We will now kind of have a more open discussion. I wonder, Jyoti, do you have any immediate comments in reaction to what the others have said?
No, just on timing, I think all credit on that goes to Professor Mueller, because if it wasn't him driving this would come out under, Brazil's presidency, or, even 2 years down the line. So yeah, he deserves the full credit on that.
Congratulations, Mueller. Congratulations.
Well, that's a funny way of saying that I was pushing her to finish this a lot faster than she did, but in fact, it turned out to be a lot longer than we expected it because she did so much more detailed, and I'm totally think that was justified now. And indeed, the timing turned out to be not late, but rather, as you say, almost perfect. Because it is, I think there is a worldwide dialogue about digital public infrastructure happening. And one question I'd like you all to react to is, to what extent is nationalism or sovereignty an actual obstacle to the development of a globalized digital infrastructure that is compatible and serves everyone's interests? Would any of you have any observations about that?
I can give my comments. I think very, very interestingly, during the time of war, the sovereignty question is being reinforced. It's not just the nationalistic agenda alone. It is also to do with the fact that a private company sitting far away can just pull the kill switch on your payment network. And that's a thought that's not comforting to many. And you hear this in very, very loud and clear in discussions in Europe, and whether it's in Paris and whether it's in Zurich or any of this conversation we are in, we see this resonating all the time. While it's not that much of an issue for America because of the companies are in there, frankly, having a president who could do random stuff is no more a theory in America. And that, when something like that happened, and when an embargo or a ban happens, you could potentially shut down a payment network or an internet, or it could shut down maps. And these, I think there is a method to that argument. And I feel, being outsider, I'm not an American, I'm sitting in India, we believe that every country ought to have in the digital realm in the next 10, 20 years, when the entire society is living in the digital realm and transacting in the digital realm, you have to ask those questions, saying that could somebody just shut down my underlying infrastructure, quite like physical infrastructure? Why digital infrastructure is not your care? It ought to be your care. And if that's your care, then you need to worry about sovereignty as an angle, not necessarily from a nationalistic point of view, from purely from ensuring continuity and independence to run your own society, from whether it's payment infrastructure, whether it's messaging infrastructure.
Well, just to give you an example, we have the internet itself, the domain name system, for example, is governed by a institution that is deliberately designed to be not controlled by any nation state, but is run by sort of the private sector and a multi-stakeholder governance entity. And so, if indeed you're dealing with hostile nation states, then of course you don't want some other hostile nation state to have controlling influence on your digital infrastructure. But is there any way to get out of that nation state business?
So I think just to complete my thoughts, Mueller, you're right, absolutely. That history has shown, like ICANN and internet, that we could put our heads together to come up with an independent mechanism to not walk into this confusion about whether somebody can shut down my payment network and so on. But what is shown post-internet, much of the digital technologies have been driven by private companies. And these private companies, internet itself was a public good. GPS, when Clinton put out on the public domain, was public good. It became a public utility, fantastic. But beyond that, much of the efforts, whether it's a cloud, whether it's mobility networks or a maps or any of that, is all became private goods in one sense, and that does create some questions around it. So I think countries probably need to make sure that either they build their own independent infrastructure, not applications, at least the underlying infrastructure, or they come up with a collective, let's say across EU, they come up with a mechanism to say, hey, we'll make sure that this is institution, create institutional independence from the nation state controls. Either way, we have to worry about it and think about it.
I imagine that Smriti and Anupam have something to say about this question. So why don't we let them go ahead. Smriti?
Okay, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I would distinguish nationalistic tendencies with national context. And with that, say that, the idea of digital public infrastructure as defined by one country and now being adopted and seen as something good by many countries, although, may appeal, but is not necessarily translatable across contexts. And we've seen that in India itself. We've seen, as the paper points out, we've seen issues in the rollout in sector after sector. And although there is, value to having this clean solution which can be adopted, the fact is that it's scaled in India because of a certain political economy, a certain context, a certain role that the state played. So, and there was, undeniable exclusion, which still continues. And, there are being solutions which are being devolved to address that. But it is a very specific kind of solution which has come up in the Indian context and has, evolved and faced problems in the Indian context. To take that idea and to try to translate it from country to country, I would say I'm not saying it's not, workable, but I would certainly say whether for nationalistic reason, whether for nationalistic pride, whether for recognition of their own social, economic, political context, I think there is value in pause and thought going into that kind of adoption, as opposed to saying that this worked for, a billion people and therefore it will work for everyone. I would worry about that sort of thinking, not to say anybody's proposing that here.
So let me pick up on the issue of digital public infrastructure, which I think is a critical one. And the question related to soft power, which is a term that's used in the paper. I've always wondered what exactly soft power means. I think it means very different things in very different contexts. There's a soft power to having American Silicon Valley enterprises being the ones that mediate the world's information flows, right? And the soft power, it comes out of, in that context, I would kind of, what exactly is the soft power? Well, it's the liberal values of free speech that are embedded within American internet platforms. So we support the free flow of information. It also, as Pramod says, has the advantage, and this is a kind of hard power advantage. It has the advantage of not being able to be shut off. And so that is, a foreign country can't prevent us from using Facebook, even though we could order Facebook to stop providing services in Russia. And so that hard power question that Pramod raises obviously became much more salient with the Russia-Ukraine invasion, in which there was a lot of contest, including at ICANN and at RIPE and all these other internet choke points for shutting. So there was the Ukrainian Foreign Communications Ministry wrote to ICANN and to the internet domain, internet numbers authorities in that context to remove .ru from the whole internet map, to vanish the Russian cyberspace. So thus you can understand the effort by Russia to create a RUNet. Now, I want to contrast India's digital public infrastructure, which it's offering to the world as a model, with the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative and their digital public infrastructure that is being sent out as well. There, it's much more corporate. It really is an effort to promote interchange between economies of the rest of the world with China. And so this is a part of building e-commerce platforms across the world, et cetera. It's not exactly clear to me what others adopting the same digital public infrastructure protocols means for India's power. What does it mean for Indian companies? I'm not exactly sure. I'm asking questions here about what exactly is the benefit to India. Now, it may just be the idea of thought leadership. That itself is enough in some sense for a country that is not seen as really, truly, I mean, I understand in India it's seen this way, but not really understood as the kind of pioneer of digital technologies, et cetera, to be seen that way and to be recognized as such, I think is significant. Much as kind of India is landing a ship on the South Pole of on one of the polar regions, in the moon. I think that can be, even though it may not have any practical benefits to India, it has some kind of political benefits. So I'd just be curious, ultimately what the goals are for India in this. And I think it may simply also be, there's a third, less selfish goal, which is pure altruism. This maybe works in India. It is, as Pramod said, helping with digital inclusion. And this represents an effort to bring people up across the world in an important way. One critical thing that we haven't talked about really, we foregrounded very much, is this question of privacy. Much of the criticism of Aadhaar, besides its compulsory nature, is the possible invasion of privacy that might be accompany a government sponsored system of identification. And so I'd love to hear more about that, especially from Pramod, who has been thinking about these directly, and from the others as well. Thanks.
Um, so we have a kind of a question posed to you, Pramod. Can you briefly respond to the question that Anupam just raised? And then we have 3 Q&As from the audience, and I have an observation I'd like to ask Jyoti about the privacy issue as well.
Okay. Yeah. So I think at this time, from a DPI soft power, Anupam, is what I'm hearing from the thing is primarily that this has shown in an extremely diverse and large country like India, 22 languages official, 100 plus languages, as you know, the crazy diversity and scale in every sense. This seemed to have brought enormous, like 500, 600 million who are completely disconnected into a connected, banked, financially included world. And this is not a joke, right? That number is so staggering that people are asking, so if you can bring 80% of the people into banking, 860 million people can receive money instantly in India. That's why during COVID, India spent, $4.5 billion to 175 million people instantly, right? We could send that money. It brings resilience into the country, and we have seen that working out here. So the most of the arguments have been in the thing that given the diversity and scale of this nation and the complexity of federal complexity, half of our states are ruled by opposing parties, right? They're not aligned to center at all. But even then, how did you manage to bring all these people? Because without the state support, it cannot happen. So I think there was something in that method to that madness that allows us to create, and that became the DPI playbook. Frankly, that became the playbook. And I think India at this time is probably altruism, saying, yeah, if it helps India, global South is very similar. And by the way, this is not just India's story. There is an equivalent story in Thailand. There's an equivalent story in Philippines. There's an equivalent story happening in Nigeria. There's an equivalent story happening in Ethiopia right now. And Brazil PIX, which she spoke about, it's not just PIX. They're open finance, the entire data ownership. They're giving back the data to the people in Brazil, quite like India. And it's enormous. So I think G20 put a vocabulary to it, something called DPI. People were doing this in Global South. May not be in Global North, definitely in Global South and developing nations. One way or other, this was happening. So I think it is more to do with sharing of knowledge and sharing of assets at this time. Now, will it have economic benefits to private companies in India? Potentially. That could be a secondary effect there. For example, when UPI goes to South Middle East, very, very high chance companies like PhonePe, who was born in India in 2016, became a $10 billion company valuation right now, could actually go quite like the way Nokia went, where GSM went, right? So it could be many companies who would say, I can provide application Paytms and PhonePes. Our financial companies, private companies, startups could go into Middle East and Southeast Asia, where it is acceptable. That's a secondary thing. Might happen, might not happen. So on the question of privacy and compulsion, Aadhaar is not mandatory. Let me be very, very clear. Aadhaar, if you're reading that, you're reading it wrong. Aadhaar is not mandated. Only it's mandated. Supreme Court allowed Aadhaar to be mandated for 2 purposes. We went through the second longest case in the history of Supreme Court in the independence India, right? And we came out successful. Clearly, Supreme Court putting out boundaries of how identity can be used. Very clear boundaries, and having a clear law supporting it. Now, India also passed our data protection law, which is very good. So in that sense, we have both Aadhaar Act, which is identity law, and the data protection law, both in play. But what did Supreme Court say? Government has the right to ask for identity when government is spending money on them in terms of direct subsidies. So if government is giving food subsidies to you, or farmer subsidy, or anything subsidies in some form of fashion, they have the right to ask the identity. And they have processes that if you don't have an identity, they give you 6 months, you can apply for it, and then you can actually get on the system. Even that was questioned by civil society, frankly. For example, for when somebody is hungry for food, should you ask for ID or should we give food? The answer is very clear to all of us that you should give food. But in the next 3-4 months, obviously you have to clean up your database. Because if you don't clean up your database, you have enormous leakages, as we India saw. India was spending 50 billion US dollars every year in 2010, now about 80 or 100 billion. And half of them were getting wasted and stolen away by middlemen. So it had to be cleaned up. So for cleaning up, a cleaner ID system and a clean bank account. Everybody needs an ID and everybody needs a bank account, right? Without which you can't give money to people. So I think that was mandated. So mandatory is only for government benefit and for income tax. India is the lowest income tax compliance, one of the compliance society. We only have 7% of India in the income tax bracket. Out of that, only 3% pays income tax. You can easily expand it to at least 3-4 times is a guess, even if you expand it. And farmers are not in the income tax either. So there's a lot of debate going around in terms of we need to clean up our act in terms of making sure that it's brought in. And Supreme Court allowed that. So those two are mandated, but there's nothing else that's mandated. You can actually get everything else with no Aadhaar or any ID mandated for that nature. But most people voluntarily use it. They're allowed to use voluntarily. Having 1.4 billion people having ID, very high chance they are using it in the airports or railway stations, and their own employment and so on.
Thank you, Dr. Verma. Smriti, you wanted to get in here. You're muted.
Sorry, I just want to make, a very quick intervention, on the position which Pramod rightly articulated is, of course, the position post the Supreme Court judgment in 2018. But we did have a long period of flux between, 2010 when the project started operating, 2016 when a law was enacted, till 2018 where we didn't know until then. And there was a long phase where, from everything from entering in an exam, and this is not upon the UIDA, this is upon how the ecosystem took this product and said, okay, if you want to enter a government exam, we are going to ask for your Aadhaar. And then the government department started saying, if you want a bank account, we want an Aadhaar. If you want to have a valid SIM card, we want an Aadhaar. So there was a long period of pain, which goes back to my point of, adoption across contexts where countries will not have to just learn from DPI, but also the pains that, India went through while it reached that stability and tried to, and many still disagree with that stability, but, that is the word of the Supreme Court. So I just wanted to throw in that quick comment.
Go ahead, Jyoti.
Just to jump in, that even though the Supreme Court limited the use of Aadhaar to PFI, like the public funds of India, the government did bring in 2 laws, 2 reiterations of laws to kind of push for Aadhaar's use beyond PFI. So that's also a development. And again, this is kind of related to the export question. I think there's a lot of confusion when we hear terms like India's exporting UPI or digital identity to Sri Lanka or other countries in the Middle East. You can see where the scope for growth for, something like UPI, which are private sector led initiatives, is going. As you rightly pointed out, our companies, which Indian homegrown companies, could be competing with global companies in different markets. And that's definitely a good goal to have. But the tension arises when we start wondering about the export of the digital identity into various markets, where the state did not only provide legitimacy, it subsidized a lot of the cost, and then through these voluntary mandatory mandates, kind of pushed its, integrated the digital identity in various aspects of the digital economy. And then is that the knowledge we want to be giving to other countries, or how do we prevent that from happening? Because the moment it goes in that direction, my fear from understanding the sovereignty-led agenda is that every country is going to create a little walled garden, where they're going to say that a bunch of our national champions are going to mediate everything in the digital economy. So how do we kind of, prevent these walled gardens from coming up and allow enough, digital trade, scope for digital trade, for cooperation, for engagement? On the question of privacy, I think I love Pramod's, the example he gave about income tax. And India is one of the least one of the nations that pays the least tax, right? But let's look at other aspects. So the state wants the citizen to become transparent to them, and that's definitely a great goal for DPIs to have. But when it comes to the governance of these DPIs and the institutions that are governing and making the rules and norms, that kind of transparency is still lacking. For example, NPCI rulemaking, the kind of whether the zero MDR should continue, not continue. There is not enough regulatory capacity currently in India, or at least even if we have the mechanisms in place, they're not being utilized, at least by the group of people who are pushing the DPI debate forward to kind of make the governance as open. So use DPI to make citizenship and citizens more accountable to the government, to dispense services in a more equitable manner. But similarly, the governors themselves should be more accountable. Another very limited point, a lot of the privacy frauds that happened in Aadhaar was because we don't have the infrastructure and we don't have the digital literacy. For example, if the internet is not working, I will go to my neighbor and entrust them with very sensitive details because I want to access that service in that moment. So a lot of thinking and investment needs to go into these other very much ignored aspects of digitization.
Good. I think that's a very important point that you just made at the beginning of your intervention, Jyoti, about this tension between this kind of globalized trade in these digital public infrastructures and the sovereignty theme. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. And we see this happening across the board with nationalist and populist movements, not just in India, but in the United States, in parts of Europe, in Russia, in Brazil. You have populists. So if the digital infrastructure is state-led and associated with the state, number one, what are other countries going to say when you try to export it, right? Look at what the US is doing. We're saying we can't have a social media platform like TikTok in the US because it's Chinese owned. Imagine if it was a very innovative and well-run identity infrastructure. You can imagine how American nationalists would go crazy about that if it was not run by American companies. So there is a tension there, and I think you draw that out in your paper. You talk about the distinction between the sort of the restriction of data and the accumulation of data. And I think how we resolve that tension is going to be one of the key factors in how the world moves forward, not just India. India is a special interest because of its scale and because it is a rising power. And again, we've seen with China, when rising powers get to the point where they're so successful economically, they begin to threaten the existing powers, and that leads to all kinds of geopolitical conflicts. Well, we really need to move to our questions. We have 5 of them on, and I see that Smriti wanted to answer the first one, so I'll let you do that.
No, sorry, I was trying to type an answer and I messed something up there. But yeah, just to then give a quick response there, I think it is a problematic proposal. The question is referring to, a proposal from the consultation that the telecom regulator in India has initiated, asking questions about selective banning of over-the-top communication services. And I think given our history with shutdowns, as well as the way we have seen, apps selectively being banned for national security or, data security purposes without often, blanket apps from a particular country, etc. I think it would be problematic to have legislative tools which legitimize that.
We'll move now to the question from JP Singh. Hello, JP. He says, we have discussed state and business involvement. I'd like to hear more about the third pillar, civil society. How was it involved in India Stack, and what are the key points of contention and convergence with the way India Stack has evolved? That's clearly a question for you, Jyoti.
I think it's a question for Dr. Verma. I think he witnessed it at close quarters, but briefly, there was a lot of civil society opposition to Aadhaar, and a lot of it has been pretty well documented. There were groups that were formed, kind of opposing the idea of imposing a digital identity on the entire population, mandating it for welfare, for granting subsidies or providing people with the kind of benefits that they were entitled to. A lot of the civil society, kind of opposition also increased as the security and fraud failures came to light. So I think fundamentally there are two groups within the civil society camp: those who feel that a digital identity is a necessary intervention but are not okay with the way it is being rolled out. And then there is another camp which completely opposes the introduction of digital identity because they see it as an extension of state surveillance. And the India Stack promoters have been kind of battling on both fronts. I'm not too sure about what kind of civil society engagement has been ongoing in terms of development of other layers. We, for example, and when account aggregators was an initial idea, there were these Google groups that were created, and they did try to involve interested stakeholders in giving inputs. But as and when the layers kind of, the ecosystem started developing, I feel there's a trend to them becoming closed off and not being open because things start becoming more controversial. So I'm not sure if there is an easy pathway to keep civil society engaged in the development and promotion of DPIs, and that's something both states and the private sector should be cognizant of. For example, under G20, DPIs were a great focus, but how many civil society folks were involved in kind of thinking through the risks and benefits or involved? So, yeah. I hope that answers the question. You're muted, Milton.
Right. Did you want to answer that, Dr. Verma?
Yeah, so I think identity is a very sensitive topic, always been sensitive topic, continues to be a sensitive topic around the world. Especially government is giving identity. It's in developing nations, it seems to be a necessary tool, but how do we make sure that doesn't get misused, protected well, kept minimal rather than maximalistic sort of design. But everything other than ID, being a way much more, Jyoti is right, I don't think there was a structural mechanism. There was many workshops where civil society were equally invited, quite like any market players. If you look at UPI workshops or DigiLocker, less of so. But for sure, other account aggregator now, ONDC. We see a lot of NGOs and a lot of market players all attending. So civil society itself, who is civil society is a question in India. So in the sense that they seem to be attending, they seem to be providing inputs. And very interesting, I want to give another point of view is that much of, other than the identity part, much of the subsequent layers like payment and data or, ONDC, the latest commerce infrastructure that's been created. NGOs are actually been adopting it. That's another side of the civil society. Civil society is an active user of this. Diksha, for example, in the education sector, you will see, we have at least, I can rattle of 30 NGOs who are working in the education sector, actively using Diksha, being part of the content creation. We have tribal languages. We have many such learning going on in Diksha, which is one of the learning infrastructure for schooling. So NGOs are actively participating in usage and co-creation thereof, but not. ID was a very peculiarly hot, contended topic of, correctly so, I presume, other compared to everything else. Other layers are much, lighter weight. I think the benefit of those layers are somewhat obvious. I think that's the reason why NGOs are participating. But I agree with Jyoti that, there's always room for improving the governance of any public utility of sort. And I think we could all look for more transparent, open governance structures, and it would be a good thing to do.
Well, okay, let's go on to the question from Gangesh. Jyoti, you said you're going to answer that one.
I think I covered a little bit of it when I talked about walled gardens, but I do feel that when, as Dr. Verma mentioned, identity, because it's largely state-led, the K is the most contentious one, but given the role of market players, both in development and kind of adoption of other layers of India stack, if they kind of don't push the state's agenda beyond a certain point, and as long as there's a clear vision and principles or a design element that is guiding the creation of these other layers with enough market and civil society participation, then it should not lead to fragmentation. With identity, it is controversial, and Smriti also gave other examples of other layers that could be controversial. I don't think that I think with the focus now more on exporting and the kind of soft power that Dr. Chandra was alluding to, India is kind of rethinking a very state-mandated, state-heavy-handed approach, and kind of letting the market players go ahead and take a lead on these matters. And on the limited point of why civil society is adopting it, it's also because we have big funders like the Gates Foundation that are pushing for adoption of DPIs by civil society that is dependent on their funds. So, I mean, if we can get funders to promote civil society to adopt, we should also get funders to involve civil society into addressing these harder questions. And I think that will actually prevent a lot of fragmentation from happening in the long term.
If you don't mind, I will also address the issue of fragmentation, seeing as how I wrote a book about it. Again, I think that if we adopt the idea of national infrastructures focused on the idea of digital sovereignty, that we will contribute to various forms of internet fragmentation. I think there are very strong economic incentives against doing that, but that it is possible, again, in this increasingly polarized world, that the digital infrastructure would become an extension of the state and its power. And I see this as something that is one of the most vital issues in internet governance or digital political economy today. All right, let's move on to the next question. This is from Anusha Rao. Could you discuss about encryption within Aadhaar, if any? Also, ID systems globally have been used as a tool for mass surveillance and is largely unequal. Aadhaar is compulsory for school admission, vaccine registrations, and even MGNREGA, which I don't know what that is, but some of you probably do. So who wants to take that question on?
I can take it. So a lot of the encryption mandates have been covered in the paper. I would encourage you to please go and read the paper. One of the issues why some of the security lapses happened in related to Aadhaar was because while the incentives were prioritized before creating boundaries for the use and accessing of Aadhaar data. So, for example, because the priority of the government and the players involved in building Aadhaar was to scale Aadhaar quickly, they created an incentive system where AUs and KUAs who would be enrolling citizens into the Aadhaar scheme were given cashbacks for every person they enrolled in the system. So given that incentive structure, a lot of the protocols for collecting and storing data were firstly not thought through initially. And when they were thought through, it took time to be implemented because the incentive structure had already created kind of wrong incentives, for collection to happen and security not to be maintained. So a lot of the problems did arise because of that, but we saw with UPI that has not been the case. And obviously, the kind of system course corrected itself where UPI updates are rolled out fairly regularly, but not very often. And the system boundaries are much better defined than they were for use of Aadhaar. So I think as these systems grow and evolve, these security protocols will also improve. I don't know if Dr. Verma would like to add his perspective on this.
Yeah, I think much has been talked about. I think there's technical documentation also available in terms of how API encryptions are done, digital signatures are done, data encryption within the system is done. But yeah, this was an evolving project, the early days versus mid subsequent days versus now. I think much has been improved on quite like any other system. But one thing I can tell you, I think, sorry, I need to drop off for another call as well. So just digitization is happening with or without us. I think it's important to understand. And this is what we see. I don't think India's help is needed. I don't think countries are waiting for India's help. There's now they're not saying, "Oh my God, you are exporting is awesome," or "I don't want to use it," or either way. Every country is knowing that in next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, there's no other way the country's young population or their population are going to be disconnected without access to internet. They are going to be on the internet. They are having smartphone. They are actually going to be doing smart electronic payments. So it's so much. While we look for a perfect answer to many of this, we are not going to get it. So I think I'm one of those realists, frankly, saying that while we should look for good conversations, look for transparency, look for good paperwork and so on, and fund the right things and support the right things. Countries are actively engaging. Forget the ID, everything else. They're digitizing agriculture. They're digitizing. Doesn't mean government is doing. Sometimes markets are doing. Sometimes private players are doing. So is private player hostaging the entire agriculture through digitization okay? Not okay? Is government doing everything okay? Who knows what the right answers? But I think these conversations ought to happen. These learnings ought to be taken in, and one country is learning. Learning is more than the code. I think the code is not what people are looking at. They can all write their own code. Okay, it's the easiest part. Software is the least of the issue. It's about how they will roll out and how they will bring their own millions of like Nigeria's 200 million people, Ethiopia 100 million plus people, right? They all need to be brought into some sort of access to basic services, payment, banking, financial savings, and so on. And everybody is going through it, and it's good. It'd be wonderful if you can bring the learnings from it and provide more concrete directions rather than grinding into a perfection discussion. And that is nobody's going to listen to us. I think that's what's going to happen because people are just doing it. So I think it is good that I like the fact that we are bringing out this paper and having this discussion to bring best practices out and give some sort of a guidance. But encryption specifically has been talked much about. So I don't, I think it's another day. Sorry. Is it okay? I need to rush, Jyoti, and
no, I would really appreciate you coming by and giving us your perspective. And it is, I think it is an impressive achievement, the level of organization that has been achieved with India Stack and the increased percentage of banking and the capabilities of the government to distribute money to welfare recipients. This is all very impressive. So thank you very much, Doctor, and we'll see you later. Thank you. Bye. So we have.
Can I add something to the encryption question and the so a few years ago there was a report that there was a breach of Aadhaar and that 1.1 million records were billion records were compromised. The security company that issued that report withdrew that report and said, no, we're sorry, we got that wrong. And so one of the things that was confusing about it was what exactly happened. There was some reporter who said there are people on WhatsApp groups selling Aadhaar information for the price of 50 rupees or whatever per account or something along those lines, like a buck an account or something along those lines. But it was hard to imagine someone paying $1 billion for the whole database, but really was very unclear whether or not there was a huge download en masse. There's always a question in security breaches as to what exactly happened. What information was actually exfiltrated? Or was there a vulnerability that was identified? Now, I think there was a confusion in that context between a vulnerability and an exploitation that happened with some records and the exfiltration of 1.1 billion records. I say this because this claim passed into law. So if you look now at biggest security breaches in history, Aadhaar will stand at the top, okay, of all the league tables that exist. And I think it just arises out of some kind of somewhat careless reporting about this because, and this is my conclusion, why I conclude that. I think if 1.1 billion records of all Indian citizens had been released and were available on the black market, we'd know. And so there would be a huge amount of identity theft and fraud that'd be kind of the norm in India. So I just want to caution that, by the way, part of the problem here was the World Economic Forum publishing a paper that included this claim. And having written papers for the World Economic Forum, I can say, they rely upon the writer to do the fact checking. And so the writer may not have carefully understood exactly the extent of the breach or the details, but I'll leave it at that.
Just to add to this, the vendor that published the security research report continued to be a vendor with UIDAI. And there was speculation that it was pressurized in retracting the report. So while it could be, misunderstanding of the nature of the breach, undoubtedly pressure was put on the vendor to kind of retract from its position, claiming that the breach of this nature had taken place, because if they were to continue being a part of the Aadhaar ecosystem. And therefore, one would assume, the incentives then really matter. And in terms of like identity fraud, there is rampant identity fraud using Aadhaar numbers in India, from health databases to driving databases, whichever service in the digital economy Aadhaar is being used for, there is Aadhaar related leakages in that particular service sector. So, it's not clear whether it's happening from that one initial leak, or is it, through other careless measures, and maybe it's a combination of both. But this is a very murky area. And again, there are no systems or processes to kind of study these security vulnerabilities. And if you are claiming the label of digital public infrastructure, then the impetus is on the government to kind of create these structures and ensure that the digital public infrastructure is indeed secure. And it's both reputationally and technically.
Can I also quickly jump in? I know we're short and probably over time, but just on that question, I think there is a distinction between a security vulnerability and a vulnerability in the design of the system. And what this particular report revealed was a design vulnerability, where there were common service centers where the journalist went, and actually these were centers across the country which were meant to facilitate people updating their Aadhaar records, but the actors working in these centers were bad actors, and they had access to the system. So it's not like the whole database was breached, but they were able to access and download, and they were selling the data of people, and that's what the journalists demonstrated. And maybe it could be a mix of factors. There was sensationalization, probably the civil society lashed on it, but equally there was pushback where people lost their jobs in that newspaper as a result of this, trying to discredit the report, which was backed by certain evidence, but maybe the state had the ability to flex greater muscles and discredit that whole story. So the truth is unknown, but there was clearly something which was demonstrated to be a breach.
Okay, well, we are kind of out of time. I'm sorry about that. It's always good that we go over time. It means that people are interested and eagerly discussing this. Again, the full paper is available on our website, internetgovernance.org. I'd encourage anybody to just sign up for our email list. We don't spam you very much. You just get notices when we have a new blog post. And it's a good way to keep up with what we're doing. Again, the focus is on digital political economy. And I think this is a path-breaking study of a comprehensive look at one country's, a very important country's attempt to really push forward in the digital age. And thanks for Jyoti for her dogged pursuit of this topic. And thank you for our panelists for your excellent commentary. And I hope we can continue this dialogue. We will see you maybe at the Internet Governance Forum or in other venues. Good day. Good night in India. Eh?
Thanks again, Jyoti.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Smriti. Thank you, Anupam.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.